Hello, and welcome to day 22 of Business English 2. At the end of our last class, you had some exercises to do. You've got a sheet of exercises here with 3 different sets, 1, 2, and 3. And we just started looking at the first ones, so let us continue with those. We went through number 1 here, and there are just 7 questions in the first section here, so let us continue there. And the directions were to combine the following sentences using and, or, but, or so to make compound sentences. Remember, when you make a compound sentence, you basically take 2 sentences, 2 independent clauses, or ICs. You take 2 independent clauses and join them together with a conjunction. What do you need before the conjunction? A comma. So to join these together, you have a sentence, comma, conjunction, sentence. Okay? And fanboys, of course, there are 7 of them. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. In this exercise, we're just choosing from for, and, or, but, or so. You don't even need to worry about the others for these, to make a compound sentence. Okay? So we looked at number 1. There are many teachers working here. They come from several different countries. So 2 sentences. How can we join these together? And why do we want to do that? Well, because they're related. And that's the idea with a compound sentence, is you can join together or combine 2 independent clauses, 2 sentences that are closely related to each other. So this, grammatically, this is correct, but because they are related, we can join them together to make it a little more simple, a little more to show that connection, to show how closely they are connected. So we said that there are many teachers working here, and they come from several different countries. So remember, when you do that, there's a few different things you have to do. You have to change the period to a comma, add the appropriate conjunction, and then the next word here, you have to change the capital letter to a lowercase letter. So make sure you do all of those things. Number 2, their origins are different, where they come from, their home countries, their roots. They understand each other. So which conjunction works best here? Their origins are different, so they understand each other? That doesn't really sound right. I mean, if their origins are different, you might think that they do not understand each other. So that doesn't really fit. And their origins are different, and they understand each other. Well, both of those are true. Let's see if we can find a better one. But their origins are different, but they understand each other. And remember, but is kind of the opposite. So their origins are different, so you might think that they can't communicate so well. They understand each other, that's sort of the opposite. So but actually fits here. Let's also consider so. Their origins are different, so they understand each other. Again, logically that doesn't really fit. Their origins are different, so they understand each other. Why would they understand each other? Because their origins are different. So that doesn't fit either. So their origins are different, comma, change the period to a comma, add the conjunction but. So even though they're from different places, they understand each other. Their origins are different, but they still understand each other. And we have to change the capital T to a lowercase t. Number 3, they all speak the same language. They can get along well with each other. So, and they all speak the same language, and they can get along well with each other? Maybe. They all speak the same language, so they can get along well with each other. That sounds a little better. They all speak the same language, but they get along well with each other? That's sort of the opposite to the previous one. They all speak the same language, so you might think, okay, they can communicate well, maybe that helps them get along. So to say, but they can get along well, that doesn't really make sense. Or they speak the same language, or they can get along well, that's one or the other, and that doesn't make sense either. So let's go with so. They all speak the same language, comma, change the period to a comma, add the conjunction, change the capital letter to a lowercase. Now they all speak the same language, so they can get along well with each other. Really? Does that make sense? Have you ever heard two people who speak the same language who did not get along? Have you ever heard somebody who speaks your language, Korean or Chinese or your native tongue? Have you heard anybody who speaks your language argue and fight and not get along? Of course you have. Just as there are many people who speak English who argue and fight and do not get along. So they all speak the same language so they can get along well with each other? That's certainly no guarantee. Now, it can help in some situations. Of course, if you can speak the same language, then you can communicate, you can explain yourself, you can share your ideas more easily. But that certainly does not guarantee that you will get along well with each other. So actually, this is kind of a stupid example, but that's the best answer for this one. Number 4, some of them can speak more than one language. They have the same mother tongue. So what is your mother tongue? Your mother tongue is your native language. Your native language or your first language. Tongue, they're referring to language, the language that you speak. So some of them can speak more than one language, so they have the same mother tongue? No, that doesn't make sense. Some can speak more than one language, or they have the same mother tongue. No, these are not separate ideas. Some can speak more than one language, and they have the same mother tongue. Or some can speak more than one language, but they have the same mother tongue. And that is the best choice. Some of them can speak more than one language. Many of them can. Comma, change the period to a comma, conjunction, change the capital T to a lowercase. But they have the same mother tongue. So even though some of them speak more than one language, they have the same mother tongue, the same native language, first language. When they communicate with each other, they may choose to write emails. They may choose to speak directly. So this is a choice here. They can write emails. They may choose to speak directly. So we need a choice here. Which conjunction, and, or, but, or so, gives you a choice? Or. When they communicate with each other, they may choose to write emails, or they may choose to speak directly. They can write or they can speak. Okay? So, again, they may choose to write emails, comma, conjunction, change the capital T to a lowercase t. Make sure you do all of those things. There's like 3, you have to choose the correct conjunction, and then there's 3 things you need to change here. Okay? They come from different places. Their accents are varied. They're different. They're not all the same. That comes from the word vary, which is a homonym with very, which mean completely different things. These are homonyms. So to vary means to change, to not stay the same. But very, of course, means a lot. It's very hot, it's very cold, it's very expensive. Okay? So, they come from different places, their accents are varied, their accents are different. The words they use are a little different. It's British English and American English. They're both English, but We certainly have different accents, just as Americans, Canadians, Brits, Australians, Kiwis, South Africans, Irish. We all speak English, but the accents are very different sometimes. And the words we use are a little different. Even in America, different regions of the country, accents are different, from a northern accent to northeast, like New York, New Jersey, to southern accents down in Mississippi and Alabama, Texas. They have a southern Texas drawl, and California. We all have different accents, and some of the words we use are different. Some words or terms, expressions are more regional. Now, do we understand each other? Mostly, yes. But sometimes somebody from a different part of the country will use a word or an expression, and the rest of us are like, what? What's that mean? I've never heard that before. Because there are some definite regional differences. Just like in Korea, even though it's geographically a small country, there are differences between the Seoul accent and the Busan accent. And I know that some of the words or phrases that people use are also different. Just as North Korea, same language, Korean, but a lot of differences in pronunciation and vocabulary and expressions. So, which conjunctions do we need here? They come from different places. As a result of that, because they come from different places, their accents are varied. So they come from different places, so their accents are varied. The words they use are a little different. This also happens. So, they come from different places, comma, conjunction, so their accents are varied, and the words they use are a little different. So remember, period changes to a comma, capital T changes to a lowercase t. Period changes to a comma, capital T changes to a lowercase t. They come from different places. As a result of that, therefore, so. They come from different places, so their accents are varied, and the words they use are a little different. All right, and number 7. Even the way they spell their words is different. They all share the same language, English. So which conjunction works here? The way they spell their words is different, or they share the same language? No, they do share the same language. Even the way they spell their words is different, and they all share the same language? Or they spell their words different, so they share the same language? That doesn't make sense. So, even the way they spell their words is different. Comma, conjunction. Even the way they spell their words is different, but they all share the same language, English. So, period changes to a comma, add the conjunction, capital T changes to a lowercase t. And I'm sure you've seen some examples of that. For example, a word like organize. In American English, spelled like that. In British English, see, my computer just changed it there because my computer is set for American spellings. And so my computer is saying this is incorrect. In British English, you'll see an S there. So there's a lot of words where in American English we use a Z. In British English, they use the letter S. And this is a good example of that because notice, see on my computer, it put a red line under that. In Microsoft Word, that little wavy red line means that there's a spelling error. Okay? So my computer doesn't like that. It says, wait, there's a problem here, John. Okay. So, I gave you this paper last time, or this handout last time, and this is just something I put together about combining sentences with conjunctions. And this just gives some basic examples. Just gives showing how to combine some sentences. And here's some, like using a series of steps. And then some very specific rules here about how to write them, and some specific examples there. Those actually come from the book called English Grammar in Use. You may have seen that series. There's at least 3 books, like a basic, intermediate, and advanced book in that series, English Grammar in Use. If you really want to improve your grammar and work on it, they've got some really good explanations, simple explanations and lots of examples, and then some exercises you can work with. So I really recommend those books if you really want to improve your English grammar. And so some of the information on this page, especially this section, came from that book. Okay. So last time we looked at simple sentences, one subject, one verb, or one independent clause. Let me say that. One independent clause. We looked at compound sentences, independent clause plus an independent clause. And then we looked at complex sentences. Complex sentence has an independent clause plus at least one dependent clause. So that made it complex. Now we're going to look at something called compound complex, which obviously is more complicated. A compound complex sentence has 2 or more independent clauses, so it has at least 2 independent clauses. That makes it compound. And 1 or more dependent clauses. The dependent clauses added on make it complex. So these are compound complex sentences. So again, I gave you this handout last time, so let us look at these examples. Okay, if we look at the first example here, it says, while Tom reads novels, Jack reads comics, but Sam reads only magazines. So notice we have a dependent clause here, noted by the DC. While Tom reads novels, that cannot exist by itself. It's not an independent clause. It doesn't make sense all by itself. Jack reads comics. Subject, verb, very simple. Independent clause. This is a sentence. Jack reads comics. Notice we have a comma and a conjunction here. What do we use a comma and a conjunction for? To join independent clauses, to make a compound sentence. Sam reads only magazines, so another independent clause. So if we only look at this part, Jack reads comics, but Sam reads only magazines, that's our compound sentence. Independent clause, comma, conjunction, independent clause. However, we have this dependent clause, while Tom reads novels. Now, what does this mean, while Tom reads novels? The word while can mean a couple of different things here. For example, while you're listening to my lecture, maybe you're also listening to music. So you could listen to music while listening to a lecture. So that means at the same time. Or while you're listening to my lecture, you fall asleep. You might do that at the same time as you're listening to the lecture. But here, it's not necessarily, it's not at the same time, but it's kind of like a Jack reads comics, or like, how should I say it? Although Tom reads novels, Jack reads comics, but Sam reads only magazines. It's more like that. It's telling us that Tom does this, and he does that, but the other people do something different. Okay? So it's giving us a signal that something else is happening, that these other people are doing something different. So, while Tom reads novels, not a complete thought. So that's the dependent clause, complex, compound. Now, that one moves up to the top. Okay, the original one. Let's look at the second one. Tom reads novels, but Jack reads comics, because books are too difficult. Tom reads novels, independent clause, comma, conjunction. Jack reads comics. Also an independent clause. So we have a compound sentence. Because books are too difficult, that's an independent clause. So Tom reads novels, but Jack reads comics. Why does he read comics? Because books are too difficult. Because books are too difficult, dependent clause. Remember, if we start with a dependent clause while Tom reads novels, we need a comma. If we have an independent clause followed by the dependent clause, there is no comma. Okay, remember the punctuation there. Tom reads novels, but Jack reads comics because books are too difficult. Compound, complex. Jack, who reads comics, rarely reads novels. However, Tom enjoys novels. So Jack rarely reads novels. That's our independent clause. Jack rarely reads novels. This phrase in the middle here, who reads comics, that's not a question. It's not a question of who reads comics, but it's giving us information about Jack. We know that Jack reads comics from these other sentences. So here we could just say Jack rarely reads novels. But why does he rarely read novels? Well, we know that he reads comics instead, because books are too difficult. So, who reads comics? This just explains or describes Jack to us. Jack, who reads comics, rarely reads novels. Notice that this has a comma before and after it. Remember, I showed you last time, if there's a comma before and after, you can actually take that out, and it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. It's not necessary. We could simply say, Jack rarely reads novels. The meaning does not change. If we add it to describe Jack, we can put a comma before and after it to show that it's not vital. It doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. Jack, who reads comics, rarely reads novels. However, Tom enjoys novels. Notice here we don't have a comma and a conjunction. We said earlier that some sentences use conjunctions, some will use semicolons. Remember, you can use a semicolon to join two independent clauses. We talked about that very early in the semester. And instead of a conjunction, we use one of these, it's called a subordinator. It's a word like however, or therefore, or furthermore. However, Tom enjoys novels. However, we need a comma here. Tom enjoys novels, another independent clause. So we have two independent clauses, compound, dependent clause, complex. Pay attention to, after the semicolon, we do not use a capital letter here. And after a word like however or furthermore, additionally, we use a comma. However, Tom enjoys novels. And one more here. People who read comics rarely read novels. Semicolon. So, independent clause, they often find books difficult. People who read comics rarely read novels. Where's our independent clause? People rarely read novels. That's an independent clause. Who read comics, that phrase describes the people. It's a dependent clause. Is it necessary to the meaning of the sentence? Can we simply say, like we did up here when we said Jack rarely reads novels, can we say people rarely read novels? That changes the meaning, doesn't it? This means that all people in general, the general population, people rarely read novels. Is that true? Not really, no. Lots of people read novels. They're very popular. So to say people read novels, rarely read novels, that changes the meaning. Which people rarely read novels? Who rarely reads novels? People who read comics. So this changes the meaning of the sentence. People who read comics rarely read novels. So notice there's no comma here or here, because this is vital. This is necessary. This cannot be removed. Up here, we can take out who reads comics. Who reads comics? We can say Jack rarely reads novels. That doesn't change the meaning. So the commas are there because it's actually removable. Those are like little clips. You can take it out. Here, this is vital, so we cannot do that. So there are no commas, no little handles you can grab. People who read comics rarely read novels. They often find books difficult. So independent clauses, compound, complex. Okay. You've got the handout on this. These may be a little complicated, may be a little confusing. Review them if they are. Okay, you've got the lecture here, and you've got the handout, so please review these. Take a moment and read this. We've been looking at different sentence types. Simple, compound, complex, compound, complex. Why? What's the purpose? Why don't we just make all simple sentences? Wouldn't that be simpler? Wouldn't that be easier? Well, let's look at this, and this explains it really, really well. We start at the top here. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Da-da-da-da-da. 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 It's monotonous. Monotonous, like monotone, mono means one tone, monotone, blah, 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 blah. It's like a drone. The sound of it drones, like drones. That sound. So if everything has 5 words, if every sentence has 5 words, then everything is the same. Everything gets very boring, and you fall asleep. It's not interesting. Now listen. I vary the sentence length, and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences, and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals. Sounds that say, listen to this. It is important. So write with a combination of short, medium, and long sentences. Create a sound that pleases the reader's ear. Don't just write words. Write music. So this is a really good explanation of why we use short sentences, medium length sentences, and longer sentences. It makes the writing more interesting. It makes it more enjoyable to listen to. It's more creative. And it keeps the audience involved because it's not monotonous. It's not all the same. Now, we've looked at how to write different sentence types. Now let's look at a few common problems. Some sentence errors. And the reason we look at these is because, as it says here, these are common problems. Not just with ESL students, but with English speakers, including native English speakers, often make these mistakes. And it's just like subject-verb agreement, or capitalization problems, or singular plural problems. Those are basic problems, but many people make those problems. And when they make those problems, it makes them look uneducated. It makes them look stupid sometimes. And it makes their writing unprofessional. It can make it inaccurate. And it makes it look bad. And you don't want that. If you're working for a company, a business, your own company, if you make mistakes, grammar, spelling, punctuation, sentence structure, it makes customers lose confidence and trust in your company. And that's a very bad thing. So that's why we look at this. That's why we don't want to make problems. So the problems we're going to look at here, something called comma splices, sentence fragments, and run-on sentences. And the solutions to these, the ways to fix these are very simple and very similar. Okay, but we'll look at these one by one and see how to fix these problems. Now, why do we need to do this? Why is it important? Well, this is a screenshot I took on my phone from George Takei. And it says here, 10 CEOs answer the question. What's the most underrated skill most employees lack? But first of all, who's George Takei? Have you heard of him? George Takei was an actor in the original Star Trek series, the original television series, which was on television, which started on television back around 1960. Maybe the late 50s, but at least during the 1960s and 70s, Star Trek was on TV. It was an original television series, science fiction show. My aunt was a huge Star Trek fan. She would wear the uniform shirts. She would go to conventions, kind of like now they have like Comic-Con. She would go to Star Trek conventions and dress in costume. And she had stacks and stacks of Star Trek novels. Well, George Takei was a cast member in the original Star Trek. And he was on what's called the bridge, which is like where they drive the ship from, the starship. This was the Starship Enterprise. You may have heard that name used in other places as well. The Starship Enterprise. And it was kind of a big deal when he was on the show because he was one of the first Asian American actors to have like a leading role in a television series. And this was back in the 1960s. So that was a big step and a very important thing for Asian people to have a major role on a mainstream television show. This is him. By the way, his character's name here was Sulu. Okay, this is Sulu with Captain Kirk. This was the captain of the ship, and Sulu was like kind of like one of the you'd call like a pilot, maybe. I'm not sure exactly what his job title was. Some sort of engineering pilot, driving the ship, basically. This is a picture of the cast when they were much older. Here again you see Captain Kirk, and this is George Takei as Sulu. This was in a much later movie that they made. This is, again, Sulu as a young man. This is him. This is what he looks like now. He's a much older man now. And now he's more into, he does like social media, more of like political and social activism, that kind of thing. So, enough about him. And here's the question again. What's the most underrated skill most employees lack? If you lack something, there's not enough of it, you're missing it, you don't have enough of it, it either doesn't exist or there's not enough of it. So the most underrated skill, something that's underrated means that it's really, really important, but most people don't think so. Or we talk about like underrated movies or actors or songs. Like if there's a song that most people think it's okay, but you think that it's the best, it's amazing, but public opinion is not so high, you could say it's underrated. The rating is not so high, but you think its value is actually much higher. So this is a skill that's actually really, really important, but people don't think about it that much. They don't put a lot of emphasis on it. Number one, what's the most underrated skill? The ability to write well. The ability to write well. This guy, David Rose, says, I'm horrified, and have been for years, at the extent, at the degree to which college graduates are apparently unable to write a clear, grammatically correct sentence. So he's saying here that it's horrible that even college graduates, university graduates, cannot write clear, grammatically correct sentences. That's a huge problem. So he's saying that is the ability to write well is actually a really, really important skill. So that's why we do this. Like that article I gave you at the beginning of the semester. The guy who said, I won't hire people who have poor grammar. Here's another example of that, where having good grammar, having good writing ability is extremely important. So let's look at these problems here. The first one we'll start off with is comma splices. It says comma splices occur when two sentences are incorrectly joined by a comma. So you have a sentence, and you join them together with a comma. Now you know that's not right. Now, first of all, what's a splice? Well, a splice is like if you have two pieces of wire or some kind of cable, and you want to join them together. What do? Well, first of all, you'd have to strip off the plastic on the end. So if I had a piece of wire here, this is a charging cable. If I, for some reason, wanted to make this longer, I'd have to strip off this coating. And same thing on the other one, strip off, remove the plastic coating, and then you twist them together. Okay, like the second picture, you twist them together to join them, and then you twist them really, really tightly, fold in all the edges, and then we'd usually cover that by some of that black electrical tape, that black shock or a short circuit. Okay, so when you join two sentences together with a comma, it's like you take a sentence, and you stick a comma here, and you join them together with nothing but a comma. Can you do that? Well, no, that's why it's called a comma splice. Okay, it's illegal. It's incorrect. Because if you have a sentence, and you want to join them together, what do you need? Comma and a conjunction. A comma and a conjunction. Comma, conjunction. So, for example, if we say, Min-sung hates kimchi, he's very unusual for a Korean. Min-sung hates kimchi, independent clause, sentence. He's very unusual for a Korean. Subject, verb, independent clause, sentence. So we have a sentence and a sentence joined together with a comma. Notice that comma is red because this is a comma splice. It's incorrect. Or we could say John is a teacher. Subject, verb, complete thought, independent clause, sentence. He works at Inha University. Subject, verb, complete thought, independent clause, sentence. Sentence, comma splice. Illegal. Cannot do this. Both of these are comma splices. These are wrong. So how do we fix them? There's three ways. Number one, because you have two sentences, you could put a period in place of the comma and begin a second sentence after it. So just separate them. You can just separate them. Or you could insert a conjunction, such as and, or, but, or so, after the comma, to make a compound sentence. Comma, conjunction, compound sentence. Or you could replace the comma with a semicolon, like we just saw. So, to fix these, number one, put a period in place of the comma. Min-sung hates kimchi, period. New sentence, capital H. We have to change this to a capital H. Min-sung hates kimchi, he's very unusual for a Korean. John is a teacher, period, capital H, he works at Inha University. Or we could insert a conjunction. Min-sung hates kimchi, so he's very unusual for a Korean. John is a teacher, and he works at Inha University, comma, conjunction. Or we could use a semicolon. Min-sung hates kimchi, he's very unusual for a Korean. We've already got a comma there. This is the simplest one. Add a little green dot. Well, not a green dot. Add a dot above the comma to separate it. Make a sentence using a semicolon. Okay? Notice after the semicolon, we do not use a capital letter here. John is a teacher, semicolon, lowercase h. John is a teacher. He works at Inha University. Very simple. So, let's look at some examples. This is using the second set of exercises on that page. Correct the comma splice error in 3 ways. Make 2 separate sentences, or add a conjunction, or replace the comma with a semicolon. So separate them, add a conjunction. You've already got a comma, add a conjunction, or you can replace the comma with a semicolon. And if you have trouble, the cat here can help you. Cat says, don't worry, I'll find all the comma splices. So the cat looking at the screen here very intently, very carefully, to help find the comma splices. So let's look at number 1 here. Scuba diving allows people to see life underwater. SCUBA is an acronym for Self-Contained Underwater Breathing Apparatus. What is an acronym? An acronym is a word formed from the initial letters of a series of other words. SCUBA is an acronym for Self-Contained Underwater Breathing Apparatus. S-C-U-B-A. SCUBA. Now originally that would have been written like this. S-C-U-B-A. And then later it was probably written as SCUBA without the periods. Now it has become such a common word, it's just a normal word in our language that we use lowercase letters. It's SCUBA. Other words that came from the same way would be like radar and sonar. Same kind of thing. An acronym comes from the initial letters of a group of words, and it's pronounced like a word, SCUBA. For example, NASA, National Aeronautic Space Administration. We talk about the Rock, the Republic of Korea. I live on the Rock, Republic of Korea. On the Rock, referring to the Korean Peninsula. FIFA, an acronym. Others, though, for example, people will sometimes say FBI or CIA are acronyms. Those actually aren't, because these are not pronounced like a word. We don't say FBI or CIA. We pronounce each letter individually. CIA, FBI. Same with USA. That is not actually an acronym. We don't say USA. Okay? So, where is the comma splice? We've been told there's a comma splice here. We need to fix it. Well, this one's easy. There's only one comma. Is it a comma splice? Scuba diving allows people to see life underwater. SCUBA is an acronym for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Yet we have two sentences separated by a comma. It is a comma splice. How do we fix it? Separate the sentences. Scuba diving allows people to see life underwater. Period, capital S. SCUBA is an acronym for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. We can add a conjunction. Scuba diving allows people to see life underwater, and, comma, conjunction, and SCUBA is an acronym for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Or we can use a semicolon. Scuba diving allows people to see life underwater. SCUBA is an acronym for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. So, when we use the semicolon, we do not need a conjunction here, and we use a lowercase letter. The only time we need to change to an uppercase letter is when we use a period, and because we're starting a new sentence here. So this word has to be capitalized. Number 2, divers wear special equipment. They can stay underwater for a long time. Again, only one comma. Very simple. Where's the comma splice? Right here. Why do they wear special equipment? So they can stay underwater. That helps them to do so. So we can separate the sentences. Divers wear special equipment, period, capital T. They can stay underwater. Divers wear special equipment, comma, conjunction, so they can stay underwater for a long time. This is the result. Or divers wear special equipment, semicolon, they can stay underwater for a long time. Number 3, the Thai soccer team entered the cave when it was dry. They got trapped when the cave flooded. This is referring to a story from a couple of years ago when a group of Thai soccer players, some teenage boys, went into a cave. There was some heavy rain, and they got trapped inside for several days. A very dramatic rescue operation. The Thai soccer team entered the cave when it was dry. Period. Capital T. They got trapped when the cave flooded. Or, the Thai soccer team entered the cave when it was dry, comma, conjunction. We could use a couple different ones here. We could say, and they got trapped, or it was dry, but they got trapped when the cave flooded. Either of these would work okay. Or a semicolon. The Thai soccer team entered the cave when it was dry. They got trapped when the cave flooded. Again, no capital letter here, no capital letter here, or here, only when you separate them with a period. And number 4. During the rescue attempt, the boys wore a wetsuit and a full face mask. They were strapped to a stretcher. To prevent them from panicking, they were heavily sedated. So, fix the comma splice. This one's a little trickier. Where is the comma splice? We have 1, 2, 3, 4 commas. Are they all comma splices? Are they all comma splices? No, they're not. During the rescue attempt. That's a dependent clause. It's like a time phrase. The boys wore a wetsuit and a full face mask. This is a sentence. They were strapped to a stretcher. That's a sentence. To prevent them from panicking. That's a dependent clause. They were heavily sedated. That's an independent clause. That's a sentence. So how do we fix this? We can separate them. During the rescue attempt, this is not a comma splice. The boys wore a wetsuit and a full face mask. Period. New sentence. They were strapped to a stretcher. Period. New sentence. To prevent them from panicking, they were heavily sedated. Notice we don't say they were strapped to a stretcher to prevent them from panicking. That's not why they were put on the stretcher. Why were they heavily sedated? They were heavily sedated to prevent them from panicking. So the sedation goes with the panicking, the panic prevention. Okay, that is not the reason they were strapped to a stretcher. So be careful that you don't separate them in the wrong place. So, and again, of course, after a period, you need a capital letter. During the rescue attempt, the boys wore a wetsuit and a full face mask. Independent clause, comma, and they were strapped to a stretcher, comma, conjunction, independent clause, comma, and to prevent them from panicking, dependent clause, comma, they were heavily sedated, independent clause. During the rescue attempt, the boys wore a wetsuit and a full face mask, and they were strapped to a stretcher, and to prevent them from panicking, they were heavily sedated. Now, grammatically, this is correct, but it gets a little awkward, so I wouldn't really recommend this one. Something like this, I think, would look better. During the rescue attempt, the boys wore a wetsuit and a full face mask, and they were strapped to a stretcher. So that works. Then I just use a semicolon here, so I'm using a conjunction here and a semicolon here, little variety. To prevent them from panicking, they were heavily sedated. Or we could do something like this. During the rescue attempt, the boys wore a wetsuit and a full face mask, and they were strapped to a stretcher. We could use a period and a new sentence. To prevent them from panicking, they were heavily sedated. So this puts a little more separation here. Okay? So we have a comma, conjunction, and making two sentences. Also grammatically correct. Or we could do something like this if we want to keep it all in one sentence. During the rescue attempt, the boys wore a wetsuit and a full face mask, and they were strapped to a stretcher. Semicolon. Furthermore, to prevent them from panicking, they were heavily sedated. So any of those work, okay? I prefer like one of the last options here probably, this or this, because I think it just keeps everything flowing a little bit better. Okay, either just using a semicolon, or you can use a semicolon with furthermore here. Okay, makes it sound a little more professional, a little more sophisticated. Okay. All right. We will stop there for today, and we will look at this next time. Some of you may remember the Yogurpresso shop that was near the back gate of the university on one of the small streets there, across from the Gym Doc place. I used to eat there a lot. I used to eat there almost every week with my office mate before he moved away. And occasionally we would go to the Yogurpresso. And on the Yogurpresso window, if you look inside here, there's a little poem called The Bird. It says, "If I am cautious, like the flap of the small bird, which sat down on the branch of the tree." Let me try that again. If I am cautious, like the flap of the small bird, which sat down on the branch of the tree. What? This has a subject and a verb, but it does not have a complete thought. It just sort of ends without completing the thought. So this is a sentence fragment. Okay? So we will look at these in more detail in our next class.